The first sign of trouble for Karen and her board came quietly one morning when the sprinklers in the HOA managed community park sputtered to a weak drizzle before cutting off entirely, leaving patches of the lawn already drying in the sun. And though the neighbors initially thought it was a small mechanical problem, by the afternoon the issue had spread, hitting homes across the subdivision. Faucets trickling, dishwashers failing mid-cycle, showers sputtering, and panic beginning to ripple through the tidy streets where families were used to everything running smoothly. Because water was something they had always taken for granted, a luxury that simply flowed whenever they turned a knob, but not this time. Not with me standing above the reservoir, key in hand, having turned down the main valve just enough to send them a message. I didn't cut it off completely at first, because I wanted Karen to sweat, to realize slowly that her empire had cracks, and sure enough, that evening she called an emergency HOA meeting in the clubhouse, her voice shrill and commanding as she announced that there was a temporary disruption to the community's water system and that everyone should remain calm while the board handled it. I wasn't there, of course, but one of my neighbors, who despised Karen as much as I did, gave me a full report, telling me how she stood at the front of the room with her binder, insisting that it was probably the county's fault, while residents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, whispering that they had never seen such a widespread outage. The next morning, I tightened the valve a little more, and by noon the entire neighborhood was dry. Toilets wouldn't flush, kids were crying, families were hauling bottled water from the gas station, and Karen was storming from house to house with a clipboard, trying to convince people that this was just a technical issue, though the sweat on her face told a different story. By day 3, desperation was setting in. And that's when she made her first real mistakes. She marched onto my property with 2 HOA board members in tow, shouting that I had no right to tamper with the system, as though I was some kind of saboteur, when in reality, I was the legal owner of the reservoir they had hijacked, and I let her scream for a full 5 minutes before calmly walking out with the deed in hand, flipping the pages right in front of her nose so she could see the signature, the stamp, the transfer of ownership, every legal detail that confirmed what I already knew she had stolen from me, and now I owned everything she depended on. The silence that fell over her when she realized what she was up against was almost comical, her face turning red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish as she tried to form an argument, but came up empty, because even she couldn't spin this into her favor. Not with the paperwork staring her in the face. The board members looked at each other nervously, clearly realizing they were in over their heads. And I took that moment to lay down my terms. The pipes they had laid across my land would be removed within 30 days. My fences would be repaired at their expense, and they would issue a formal written apology acknowledging their trespass, or else the water would remain off indefinitely. Karen tried to laugh it off, claiming the community couldn't possibly survive without its water supply and that I would be the one held liable if people suffered. But I leaned in close and told her in no uncertain terms that the only liability here was her arrogance, and that she had better think long and hard about how much fight she really had left in her, because I was just getting started. She left in a fury, heels kicking up dust as she stomped back toward the clubhouse. But I could tell by the tremble in her voice that she knew the balance of power had shifted. And for the first time, she wasn't holding the reins. Over the next week, I watched with quiet satisfaction as the neighborhood descended into chaos. Residents arguing with the board, kids forced to bathe with bottled water, lawns turning brown and brittle, garden parties canceled, and Karen scrambling to find an alternative supply, even going so far as to call in water trucks to deliver temporary relief, a stopgap measure that cost the HOA thousands of dollars and infuriated the very residents she relied on for support. Every time one of those trucks pulled into the subdivision, I smiled a little wider. Because the message was clear. She had thought she could take from me without consequence. But now she was paying the price, quite literally. And the cracks in her empire were widening with every dry faucet. Still, I knew Karen well enough to realize she wouldn't back down easily. And sure enough, rumors began to spread that she was preparing to take me to court, claiming that I was abusing my ownership of the reservoir to extort the HOA, but I wasn't worried. Not with the deed in my safe and the surveyor's reports proving exactly where the pipes had been laid. No, Karen could scream and stomp all she wanted. But this time, she had no leverage, and I had all of it. And the best part was knowing that the longer she delayed, the more her community would turn against her. Because people can put up with a lot of nonsense from an HOA, but take away their water. And suddenly loyalty dries up faster than a summer lawn in August. It's amazing how far an HOA will go when they believe their power is absolute. And if you've ever dealt with one of these overreaching organizations, you know exactly how they can twist rules and cross lines just to show they're in control. But nothing prepared me for the day I walked out to the back pasture of my property and found my fence cut clean through and pipes laid directly across my land without permission. A blatant violation that turned my stomach with rage. Because it wasn't just about property lines, it was about respect, and my HOA had none of it. But let me tell you right now, this story doesn't end with me writing complaint letters or backing down. It ends with me buying the very source of the water they were stealing from me and turning off their entire supply, and trust me. The look on Karen's face, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, when her sprinklers went dry, is something I'll never forget. But before I take you there, make sure you stick around until the end of this story and subscribe to Sham Stories, because what you're about to hear is a perfect example of what happens when arrogance meets someone who knows how to fight back. It all began on a quiet morning when I noticed something strange in the field behind my barn. The kind of thing that made me pause mid-step as I was carrying feed buckets out to the animals. Because the wooden posts I had put up years ago to mark the property line were knocked down in a single clean slice, like someone had taken a saw to them. And beyond the fallen posts, a fresh trench had been dug. Dirt piled neatly along the edges, and inside the trench were bright blue plastic pipes stretching across my pasture in a straight line toward the HOA-controlled subdivision on the other side of the ridge. At first I thought maybe it was a county project or some kind of municipal work, but a quick call to the utility office shut that idea down immediately. They hadn't approved any work in my area, which left only one answer, and sure enough, when I marched down to the HOA clubhouse demanding an explanation, there was Karen standing tall in her usual floral dress with her binder of rules clutched like a holy book, smirking as though she'd been expecting me, her voice dripping with condescension as she explained that the community had voted to extend their water system and my land just happened to be the most convenient path, so they'd help themselves, as though that was supposed to make sense. As though private property was just an afterthought to her empire. When I pointed out that cutting through my fence was trespassing and laying pipe without permission was illegal, she had the audacity to shrug and tell me that sometimes progress requires sacrifice, and in her mind, I should be proud to be contributing to the neighborhood's growth, as though stealing my land was a favor to me. The fury that boiled in my chest was something I can hardly put into words. Because it wasn't just the invasion, it was the smug way she dismissed me. The way she acted like I had no say in my own property, and as I stood there, staring at the rows of HOA board members nodding along behind her like obedient little sheep, I realized that arguing with them was pointless. They weren't going to undo what they had done. Not willingly, not unless I made them. For the next week, I tried the legal route, filing complaints with the county, sending certified letters, even calling in a surveyor to document the damage and the placement of the pipes. But Karen and her crew were slippery, claiming they had easement rights, waving around papers that looked official but were nothing more than homemade documents stamped with their HOA seal. And while the sheriff sympathized when he came out to look, he admitted his hands were tied unless I wanted to take them to civil court, which could take years and cost thousands. That's when I realized I couldn't play their game. I needed to change the rules, to hit them somewhere they'd never expect. And when I started tracing those pipes back to their source, following the path uphill into the woods, I found something incredible. The HOA's entire water system didn't actually come from the county lines at all, but from a small private reservoir that had been neglected by its previous owner and was now up for sale. I couldn't believe my luck here was the beating heart of their precious water supply, sitting in limbo, and all it would take was the stroke of a pen and a chunk of cash to make it mine. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with plans. Imagining the look on Karen's face when she realized she had cut through my fences, stolen my land, and tied her entire system into a resource I now controlled. Within 2 weeks, the deal was done, the title in my name, and I stood at the edge of that reservoir staring at the valves and pumps that fed the very pipes crossing my land, holding the keys to their lifeline in my hand. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I smiled, because now, finally, I had the power. And when Karen's sprinklers went dry, she was going to learn a lesson about arrogance she'd never forget. Karen's defeat in court should have been the end of it, the kind of decisive judgment that made most people throw in the towel. But if there was one thing everyone in that neighborhood had learned about her, it was that she thrived on control. And no legal ruling or angry mob was going to stop her from trying to bend reality back into her favor. So while the rest of the subdivision simmered with resentment and confusion, Karen went underground, literally launching a series of desperate, underhanded schemes to get the water flowing again. Starting with midnight crews of volunteers, she had roped in with promises of saving the community, men and women in work. Gloves and hoodies sneaking across my property under cover of darkness with shovels, pickaxes and lengths of PVC pipe, thinking they could dig a new line and reconnect to the system without me noticing. The first night I caught them, I was out walking the property with a flashlight and my dog when I heard the metallic clank of tools and the low murmur of voices near the back fence. And when I shined the light across the field, I saw 3 men sweating as they tried to cut into the earth, one of them dropping his shovel in panic when the beam caught him. They bolted, crashing through the brush, and I could hear Karen's voice hissing at them from the shadows, telling them not to stop, that they had a right to be there. But they scattered like scared rabbits, leaving their tools behind, which I collected and later handed over to the sheriff's deputy, who shook his head in disbelief. The following night, I installed trail cameras and motion sensors, and sure enough, the pattern repeated itself. Small groups sneaking in, trying different angles, each time thwarted by alarms that sent them fleeing before they got more than a few feet into the soil. I documented everything, saving the footage in case Karen tried to drag me back into court. And after the 3rd attempt, I called a press contact I knew, tipping them off that the HOA's president was organizing vigilante-style trespassing to break a lawful ruling. And within days, the story hit local news. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just the villain of my story, she was a pariah in her own community, caught on camera screaming at her crew to dig faster while deputies escorted them off my land. Her face plastered on the evening broadcast under the headline, HOA, president accused of trespassing to steal water. The fallout was swift and brutal. Residents who had once stayed neutral now came forward demanding her removal. Local businesses cut ties with the subdivision's contracts, and even her closest allies began to distance themselves, muttering that she'd gone too far. But instead of backing down, Karen shifted tactics again. This time, trying to spin herself as the victim, claiming on social media that I had fabricated the videos, that I was staging the entire ordeal as some sort of vendetta against her. And though a handful of gullible followers rallied behind her, most people laughed it off, especially when the sheriff himself held a press conference confirming the arrests and showing confiscated tools that matched the footage. By this point, my patience was running thin, not because I was losing control, because I realized Karen's obsession wasn't just about water, it was about power, the kind of pathological need to dominate others that made her dangerous. And I wasn't about to let her continue playing games on my property. So, I took my own countermeasures a step further, hiring a contractor to install reinforced fencing along the perimeter, burying warning signs deep into the ground, and running a private water line to my house that bypassed the reservoir entirely, ensuring that even if Karen somehow pulled off one of her stunts, she couldn't cut me off in retaliation. I also met with Randall, my lawyer, to discuss the possibility of filing a civil suit against the HOA for damages. Since their trespassing and interference had cost me time, money, and peace of mind, and when he heard the extent of Karen's antics, he grinned and said it was time to go on the offensive. We filed the paperwork within a week, seeking compensation for property damage, legal fees, and punitive damages for harassment. And the look on Karen's face when she was served with the notice was priceless. A mixture of shock and fury, as though she couldn't believe someone dared to challenge her throne. Meanwhile, the subdivision itself was crumbling under the pressure, with residents openly fighting in the streets. half of them demanding Karen's immediate resignation while the other half begged me to restore water. And the HOA board meetings devolved into shouting matches that spilled out into the parking lot. People waving signs and screaming that they'd had enough. At one particularly heated meeting, caught on someone's cell phone and uploaded online, Karen screamed at the crowd that she was the only one fighting for them, that without her leadership, the neighborhood would fall apart. But her words were drowned out by boos and chants of "step down" and "we want water," which only made her double down, her voice cracking as she swore she'd never surrender. By then, it was clear to everyone that Karen wasn't fighting for the community anymore. She was fighting for herself, desperate to cling to the last shreds of authority, even as her empire collapsed around her. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her, because desperation makes people dangerous, and I had no doubt she would try one last trick to turn the tables, something reckless enough to put everything at risk. And the only question left was whether I'd be ready for her when she made her move. Asterisk. Karen's desperation reached a fever pitch not long after the lawsuit was filed, and while most people in the subdivision were scrambling to find bottled water, installing rain barrels, or flat out abandoning their lush lawns in favor of dry gravel landscaping, she was plotting something darker, something that went beyond her clumsy midnight trespassing attempts. Because one evening, as I drove back from town, I noticed the gate to my property hanging loose on its hinges, padlock cut clean through with bolt cutters. And my stomach dropped as I realized Karen had decided to escalate from digging holes to outright sabotage. Sure enough, as I crept down the dirt road with my headlights off, I saw flashlights bobbing near the reservoir, a cluster of shadows moving quickly as they tried to rig some kind of makeshift pump system into the water, hoses running out toward the road where a rental truck idled. And for a moment, I just sat there in my truck, gripping the wheel, torn between storming down there myself or calling the sheriff. But then I remembered the trail cameras and motion sensors, which were already recording everything. I dialed the sheriff's office first, explaining the situation, then pulled a little closer and honked my horn, the sound blaring across the night like a shotgun blast, scattering the intruders like startled deer. Some bolted for the truck, others dove into the brush. But one stood her ground, Karen, of course, standing defiant with her fists clenched, yelling across the water that I couldn't keep her community hostage forever, that one way or another, they would take what they needed. I told her flatly that she was trespassing and that law enforcement was on the way. And for a split second, I saw doubt flicker across her face. But her pride wouldn't let her retreat. So instead, she screamed insults until the flashing blue lights of the sheriff's cruisers appeared on the road. And only then did she try to melt into the shadows with the others. Too late, because deputies were already spreading out and catching her people one by one. Watching Karen being shoved into the back of a squad car while cursing my name was satisfying, but it also hammered home how far she was willing to go. And I realized this fight was no longer just about water, it was about principle. About standing up to a bully who had been given power for too long. The sheriff later told me they were charging her with trespassing, vandalism, and attempted theft of services. But somehow, she still managed to post bail within hours, walking free with that same manic gleam in her eyes. And by morning, she was on social media again, spinning the narrative that she had been unfairly targeted, painting herself as a martyr suffering for the greater good. To my shock, a handful of residents still believed her, parroting her lies online, but the majority had reached their breaking point. And I began receiving thank you notes from neighbors I barely knew. People telling me that standing up to Karen had given them the courage to speak out too. Some even offered to testify on my behalf in the civil case, sharing their own horror stories of fines, harassment, and intimidation at her hands. And slowly, the tide began to turn in my favor. The community realizing that Karen was not their savior, but their jailer. Still, her die-hard supporters clung to her. Together they tried one final tactic. They organized a protest outside my property, waving signs that said "Turn the water back on" and "End the hostage crisis," chanting loud enough to echo across the hills, trying to shame me into relenting. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I called the sheriff again. And this time, deputies escorted the protesters off for blocking a county road, handing out citations left and right. And though Karen screamed that her First Amendment rights were being trampled, the law was clear trespassing, and illegal gatherings had consequences. After that spectacle, even her loyalists began to scatter. Tired of fines, tired of being embarrassed, tired of Karen dragging them into one disaster after another, and by the end of the week, she was a general without an army, isolated and raging. Meanwhile, my lawyer informed me that the civil case was looking stronger by the day, especially with the mounting evidence of sabotage and harassment, and that Karen personally could be held liable for damages. Which made me smile because I knew her own finances were stretched thin from posting bail and hiring lawyers. The image of her facing not just a loss of power, but financial ruin was poetic justice, and though part of me almost felt pity, I reminded myself of the cut fences, the destroyed gates, the sleepless nights spent guarding my property, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. Karen had declared war on me, and now she was losing badly. What I didn't realize, though, was that she had one more reckless play left in her. A desperate stunt that would push this battle into uncharted territory and force the entire county to finally decide once and for all whose side they were on, and whether the HOA could survive the storm its leader had unleashed. Karen's final desperate move came just when I thought she had been beaten into submission. Because instead of retreating or preparing for the financial ruin that was inevitably headed her way, she doubled down in a way that stunned even her few remaining supporters, staging what she called a community reclamation, which was really just a brazen daylight raid. One Saturday morning, I woke to the low rumble of heavy machinery and the faint roar of voices. And when I rushed outside, I saw a convoy of trucks, vans, and even a rented bulldozer creeping down the county road toward my property, led by Karen herself standing in the passenger side of a pickup with a megaphone, bellowing about justice and community rights as if she was leading some kind of revolution. Behind her, a mob of about 40 residents, many holding tools, buckets, or banners, followed in a ragtag procession, their chants growing louder as they approached my gate. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just another half-baked stunt. This was an organized attempt to take back the reservoir by force, a move so reckless it bordered on insanity. I dialed the sheriff immediately, explaining the situation. But I knew response times in our rural county could be slow, and in the meantime, I had to face them myself. By the time they reached the gate, Karen had already leaped out of the truck, waving bolt cutters like a trophy as her followers cheered. She cut through the chain with a dramatic flourish, screaming that the water belonged to the people and that I couldn't keep it from them. And before I could even shout a warning, the mob surged forward, pouring onto my land in a tidal wave of noise and anger. Some ran straight toward the reservoir. Others began yanking at my fences. And the bulldozer rumbled menacingly closer, as though they actually intended to plow through everything in their way. I stood my ground at the head of the dirt road, heart pounding, trying to keep my voice steady as I shouted that they were trespassing and that law enforcement was already on the way. But Karen, drunk on the adrenaline of the crowd, screamed back through her megaphone that I was a thief, that I had stolen their water, and that justice would be served. For a moment it felt like the whole world had tilted on its axis, and I wondered if they might actually overwhelm me, if I might lose everything I had fought so hard to protect. But then the wail of sirens split the air, and over the hill came not one, not two, but an entire fleet of sheriff's cruisers, lights flashing, sirens screaming, the cavalry arriving faster than I could have hoped. The sight of law enforcement barreling down the road broke the mob's momentum instantly. People faltered, glancing nervously at each other, their bravado evaporating as deputies jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting orders for everyone to back away from the reservoir and drop their tools. The bulldozer driver killed the engine immediately, raising his hands as deputies swarmed him. And in minutes, the mob had been corralled. People lined up with their hands behind their heads. Stunned silence, replacing their earlier chants. Karen, though, wasn't ready to surrender. She shrieked at the deputies, demanding they arrest me instead, insisting that I was the criminal. But when the sheriff himself stepped forward, face hard as stone, and told her she was under arrest for trespassing, incitement, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment, Her jaw dropped as though she couldn't comprehend the words. She fought like a wildcat when they tried to cuff her, twisting and kicking, screaming that she was the rightful leader of the community and that this was all a mistake. But the deputies weren't gentle this time. And soon, she was shoved into the back of a cruiser, her face pressed against the glass, as the mob she had whipped into frenzy now stared at her in stunned betrayal. Watching her be driven away was surreal, almost anticlimactic after so many weeks of battle. But at the same time, it was the moment I had been waiting for, the collapse of her reign, the end of her arrogance, the final crack in the facade she had built for years. In the days that followed, the fallout was immense. Local news plastered the footage of the raid everywhere, showing Karen cutting my gate, rallying her mob, and being hauled off in handcuffs, her once pristine reputation obliterated in a matter of hours. Residents who had followed her blindly now turned their anger on her, furious that she had dragged them into criminal charges, fines, and public humiliation, and the HOA board scrambled to distance themselves, resigning en masse rather than face the storm. My civil case gained even more strength, with the mountain of new evidence, and Randall, my lawyer, told me with a grin that we were looking not just at damages but potentially a complete dismantling of the HOA itself, a legal precedent that could free the entire community from Karen's stranglehold forever. As for me, I finally exhaled, sitting by the reservoir at sunset one evening with the water calm and still, knowing I had done what needed to be done, that I had stood up to a tyrant and won, though part of me also knew the battle wasn't entirely finished yet, because Karen wasn't the type to give up even behind bars, and there was always the chance she'd try one last desperate maneuver. Still, with her empire crumbling, her allies gone, and the law squarely on my side, I finally felt like I could see the finish line, the light at the end of the tunnel, and I was ready to walk through it, no matter what she threw at me next. Karen wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat, and though I had her backed into a corner with the deed to the reservoir and the pipes cutting across my land, she came back swinging in true HOA dictator fashion, this time with lawyers in tow, filing an injunction at the county courthouse accusing me of malicious interference with essential resources, as though I had woken up one day and decided to play the villain in her drama. But what she failed to mention in her fancy complaint was that she and her board had been trespassing on my land for months, digging trenches without permits, cutting fences that marked property lines, and laying pipe to siphon off water they had no legal claim to, all while acting like it was their God-given right. And now she wanted to paint herself as the victim. I received the notice one gray morning, hand-delivered by a deputy who shook his head and muttered that this wasn't the first time Karen had dragged someone into a courtroom, and I thanked him before reading the paperwork, already knowing that her case was flimsy, but still recognizing that she could waste my time and money if I didn't stay sharp. So I did what any reasonable landowner would do. I hired my own lawyer, a no-nonsense man named Randall who had spent 30 years handling property disputes and who chuckled when he saw the complaint, saying, "This is what happens when someone thinks the rules don't apply to them." He immediately began drafting our response, attaching copies of the deed, survey maps, and photographs of the cut fences and illegal pipes, making it abundantly clear that if anyone was guilty of malicious interference, it was the HOA itself. While the legal wheels turned slowly, life in the subdivision grew worse by the day. The water trucks that Karen brought in costing small fortunes and only providing temporary relief. The lawns shriveling into brown carpets, the community pool sitting empty and cracked, and the residents whispering louder and louder about their dissatisfaction, some even calling emergency meetings to demand Karen's resignation. But Karen, stubborn as ever, doubled down on her lies, telling people that I was a greedy landowner trying to strangle the community into submission. And though a few die-hard loyalists believed her, most people were tired of the spin and just wanted their faucets to work again. One evening, I was sitting on my porch when a couple from down the road stopped by, introducing themselves as Greg and Susan, explaining that they had lived in the subdivision for 10 years but had never seen it so tense, and they wanted me to know that not everyone supported Karen, that many families respected the fact that I had stood up for my rights, and that if I ever needed neighbors to testify against the HOA, they'd be there. Their support meant more than I let on, and it was clear that the tides were shifting, and that Karen's iron grip on her community was slipping, even if she refused to admit it. The following week, court proceedings began. A packed courtroom filled with angry residents who wanted answers. Reporters sniffing around for a juicy story about an HOA feud gone wrong. And Karen sitting at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, chin held high, glaring at me across the aisle as though her hatred alone could break me. But when Randall laid out the evidence, displaying photographs of her board members trespassing with shovels and PVC pipes, showing the notarized deed transferring the reservoir into my name, and even calling the surveyor as a witness to confirm the boundaries, it became clear to everyone, including the judge, that Karen's case was built on sand. Her lawyer stammered through cross-examinations, trying to spin the narrative that the HOA was acting in the public good by securing water for the neighborhood. But every time he said it, Randall reminded the court that public good doesn't excuse private theft, and that if Karen's board had wanted water rights, they should have negotiated legally instead of sneaking through fences with bolt cutters. By the end of the second day, the judge looked tired of the whole charade, making sharp remarks about HOA overreach and hinting that Karen's complaint was dangerously close to frivolous. When the ruling came down a week later, it was as decisive as I could have hoped. The HOA's claims were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile, and the judge warned Karen that further harassment could result in sanctions. For me, it was vindication, proof that the law was on my side. But for Karen, it was a devastating blow, one that left her humiliated in front of her neighbors. Though knowing her, she wasn't about to give up. Sure enough, the very next day, she was back on her soapbox, standing on the clubhouse steps with a megaphone, shouting that the courts were corrupt, that I had bribed officials, that she wouldn't let one selfish man destroy her community. And though a handful of residents still clapped for her, most rolled their eyes or walked away, muttering that enough was enough. It was around then that I decided it was time to tighten the screws, because while Karen was busy shouting into microphones, her subdivision was falling apart and the power to fix it rested in my hands alone. I closed the valve further, cutting their supply completely for 3 consecutive days, forcing families to pack up and leave for relatives' houses, forcing businesses in the community's strip mall to shut down temporarily, and forcing Karen into yet another corner where her bluster couldn't help her. From my porch, I could hear the distant shouts, see the delivery trucks pulling in with pallets of bottled water, and watch as the once pristine streets turned into battlegrounds of frustration and resentment. And while part of me felt sympathy for the families caught in the middle, another part of me knew this was the only way to make Karen truly understand that her actions had consequences. By the end of that week, angry residents started showing up at her door, demanding she step down, demanding answers. And some even showing up at my property to beg me to restore the water, offering to pay directly if necessary, and I had to explain calmly that I wasn't the villain here, that their anger should be directed at the woman who had lied to them and stolen from me. The look on their faces told me they understood, and little by little, the community that Karen had once ruled with an iron fist was turning against her, though I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Because Karen wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. And I had a feeling her next move would be even dirtier than the last. The weeks after Karen's arrest felt almost surreal, like the calm after a storm. But underneath that calm was the rumble of something bigger. The final reckoning that would decide not only her fate, but the future of the HOA itself. And it all came to a head in the county courthouse, where my civil suit and her criminal charges collided into a spectacle that drew reporters, neighbors, and even people from other towns who had followed the drama through headlines. Walking into that courtroom, I could feel the weight of it all pressing down the trespasses, the sabotage, the midnight raids, the mob she led onto my land, and though I tried to stay composed, my pulse hammered as I took my seat, glancing across the aisle at Karen, who looked nothing like the commanding queen bee she once pretended to be. She sat pale and drawn, her hair frizzed, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. But even then, she tried to keep her chin high, whispering furiously to her lawyer as though sheer willpower could still bend the outcome in her favor. The trial stretched on for days, each side presenting evidence. But it was clear from the start that Karen's case was built on sand. My lawyer Randall presented document after document proving my ownership of the reservoir. Videos of her trespassing, photos of the sabotage, testimonies from neighbors who had suffered under her reign, while her defense scrambled with half-baked excuses about community rights and misunderstandings that crumbled under cross-examination. The moment that sealed her fate came when the sheriff himself took the stand, describing in detail the raid, the trespassing, the danger posed by the bulldozer. And when he finished, you could hear a pin drop, the jury staring at Karen with undisguised contempt. When the verdict was read, it was almost anticlimactic. Guilty on multiple counts of trespassing, vandalism, and reckless endangerment, and liable for damages in my civil suit to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The gasp from the courtroom was followed by murmurs, and Karen's face went sheet white, her composure cracking as she tried to stand, shouting that this was all a conspiracy, that the judge was biased, that the jury had been manipulated. But the bailiffs moved quickly, restraining her as she kicked and screamed, dragging her out of the courtroom in disgrace while the cameras rolled. The HOA, stripped of its leadership and now facing bankruptcy from the damages, voted to dissolve within weeks, the community finally free from its grip. And for the first time in years, residents could live without the constant threat of fines, harassment, or control. Some came to my door to thank me personally, shaking my hand, offering baked goods, or simply saying they were sorry for ever siding with Karen. And while I wasn't looking for gratitude, it felt good to know that the neighborhood could finally breathe again. As for the reservoir, I kept it under lock and key, restoring the fences and keeping control firmly in my hands. Because I had learned the hard way that trust could be broken, but vigilance was my best safeguard. In quieter moments, I thought about Karen sitting in a cell, stripped of everything she once wielded like a weapon, and though part of me almost pitied her, I knew she had dug her own grave with arrogance, greed, and cruelty. The irony was almost poetic. The woman who thought she could control everyone had been undone by the very people she claimed to represent, exposed and defeated because she underestimated the one thing she could never: accountability. Standing by the water's edge one evening, watching the sun set in hues of gold across the reservoir, I realized that this chapter was finally closed, that I had not only defended my land, but restored balance to a community terrorized for too long. And with that realization came peace, the kind I hadn't felt in months. But let me leave you with this: if you've ever been pushed around by someone like Karen, someone who thinks rules don't apply to them and power gives them the right to trample others, remember this story. Remember that standing up and fighting back can work. And never let a bully convince you that you're powerless, because you're not. If you enjoyed this story and want more dramatic real-life HOA battles and unbelievable neighborhood showdowns, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.